Please find your seats. Oh, I should call Fred and Bill. Very smooth. So today we have a special presentation. Fellow Ezra-Habonim member Bernie Black, Professor Bernie Black, Bernard Black, will be speaking to us about his, as we've been discussing, his recent long period in Israel, which he does every year with his wife Kate. Bernie is the Nicholas D. Chabraja Professor at Northwestern University with positions at the Pritzker School of Law, the Kellogg School of Management, the Department of Finance, and the Institute for Policy Research. Bernie's research areas include health policy and medical malpractice, empirical methods for causal inference, law and finance, and international corporate governance.
None of which has anything to do with what I'm going to talk about.
None of which has anything to do with what he's going to talk about. His recent book, also having nothing to do with what you're about to talk about, is Medical Malpractice Litigation, How It Works, Why Tort Reform Hasn't Helped, published in 2021. Bernie's the founding chair of the annual conference on empirical legal studies and a founding editor of the Journal of Law, Finance, and Accounting, and has run a annual summer workshop at Northwestern. He is among the leading empirical authorities in the US, empirical legal scholars in the US, with over 150 published articles and over 31,000 citations on Google Scholar. That's 31,000. And a striking coincidence, I have used Google 31,000 times, even more, maybe, Bernie. So in any event, Bernie will be speaking about his sort of opening words about his impressions, having just been in Israel, and then I'll ask him a few questions, and we might have time for extra questions from the congregation, including those who are at home. And Bernie will also be with us during the Kiddush if you want to engage in conversation with him at that time. Thank you so much, Bernie Black.
So thank you for the opportunity. Question for me is what to tell you that you don't already know that might be interesting and also true to my sense of the Israeli mood. So my wife and I lived with our family in Israel from 2017 to 2019. We became Israeli citizens. We go back for 6 weeks or so every year. We were in Tel Aviv from mid-December through late January, teaching at Tel Aviv University and University of Haifa. I'm going to Jerusalem next week for a week. I want to say a few, so I know a fair amount, right? I'm not a native Israeli, but I know a fair amount. I pay a lot of attention. So I want to say a few words about our experience about the Israeli mood and what the future might hold. My sense of the Israeli mood is personal, but it does come from talking to many people, reading the Israeli press, mostly in English, and from my wife, who's a native Russian speaker and reads the Russian language news from Israel. With the caveat that I spoke mostly to two groups. The first are Israeli academics, middle-aged, a few of them called up as reserves, Miluim themselves, but many with children in the army or the Miluim. And second, Russian Israelis. These two groups often have very different views. So first, living in Tel Aviv was strange. It felt almost normal, but everyone knew that it wasn't. There was an active war less than 2 hours to the south. By that time, about 80 Tel Aviv University students had been killed, either on October 7th or after that. Pictures of the hostages, the Hatufim, and those killed were prominent everywhere, in the airport, in the street, in the Tel Aviv Law School building. The slogan, B'yachad nenatzeach, together we will win, was everywhere, maybe even more than Am Yisrael High. Israeli flags are everywhere. There is no shortage of fighting spirit, no shortage of support for the army. We rented an apartment with a mamad, an in-apartment bomb shelter. We heard rocket sirens only twice. Hamas had largely run out of rockets by then. One of them was midnight on New Year's Eve, the most important holiday of the year for the Russian Israelis, that Hamas decided they would seek to interrupt. But the threat of a Hezbollah attack was always there. And I dare say in other countries, apartments and hotel rooms don't come with bomb shelters. On the street, Google Maps showed the location of the nearest bomb shelter for those who might need to find one on short notice. Again, an innovation. You won't find the nearest bomb shelter if you look on Google Maps in the US. Many people volunteered as and how they could to pick fruit, to provide food and clothing to soldiers. I was planning to teach at Tel Aviv University. I volunteered to teach at Haifa as long as I was already there. To volunteer, you needed to move fast to grab an opportunity, or someone else would get there first. My wife and a friend went to pick fruit in the south. They came back. They stopped at a small restaurant. While there, they saw some soldiers apparently returning from Gaza. They offered to the proprietor to pay for their meal. The proprietor said no. So they asked why. And so let me see if I can get the tone of the answer right. It's something like this. Ma aten hoshvot? Aten rishon? Lo. Do you think you're first? You're not, to offer. There was huge gratitude wherever we went that we were simply there, that we chose to come when so many canceled their trips, that we volunteered. The Israelis deeply welcome whatever support we can provide, in whatever form, whether that's visiting or fighting anti-Semitism at home. And I might say, for those who are thinking about it, this is a great time to visit Jerusalem. It isn't full of tourists. Israel has a people's army. Everyone serves. You know this, but may not appreciate how important it is. The Israelis are sending their own sons and daughters to fight. We know many people whose children were fighting in Gaza, and a few whose children were killed fighting against Hamas. Israel lost 1,200 people on October 7th. It could have lost twice as many without the individual heroism of many. The senior army officers who didn't wait for orders, but got in their cars, got their weapons, and drove south to help as they could. Kibbutz defenders who chased away attackers from some kibbutzes, even though they failed at others. Bedouins who saved many from the Nova Music Festival by driving there on unpaved back roads, rescuing those whom they could, and then coming back for war to save the Jews. One story about a friend who lost her son. He was part of the first response on October 7th. He was killed. She tried to retrieve his body soon enough so she could save his sperm. The army took 3 days to deliver the body. By then it was too late. Her response was to launch a campaign supporting a new law requiring the army to retrieve sperm from dead male soldiers while they can. She might succeed. Leave aside whether this is a sensible effort, I have my doubts. It gives a sense of Israeli resilience in the face of tragedy. So let me go on to some Israeli views on key issues, and we're going to try to do this in sort of Q&A form.
Great. Thank you so much, Bernie. Thank you so very much. Okay, in your perspective, we hear a lot. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Okay. We hear a lot about, Netanyahu wanting to, accomplish the goals of the war. But the goals are somewhat, they're twofold. Eradication of Hamas, bringing the hostages home. So what do you think takes priority? What is the mood and attitude in Israel in that regard?
So not for everyone, but for most, according to both the polls and my own sense, the essential task is removing Hamas from power so October 7th doesn't happen again in 10 years. And then pushing Hezbollah back from the Lebanon border so people can return to their homes near the border. There are still 80,000 people displaced from the north who can't safely return home. The free the hostages at any price voices are loud, but they are a minority. The dominant view is closer to recover the hostages if you can, but win the war because you must. This one, I think Netanyahu and his war cabinet are getting right. I think that Yitzhak Herzog, the Israeli president, is speaking for the country mood when he says Hamas must be beaten, Gaza must be demilitarized, and the West Bank must stay demilitarized. Given that goal, there are deals for the hostages that are worth making, but others that are not. I think the view that removing Hamas from power is critical is held by most Israeli academics, otherwise liberal ones who had their eyes opened by just the sheer viciousness of the Hamas attack and the wide support that Hamas has in the Palestinian street. It is held by every Russian Israeli I know.
So Bernie, firstly, yeah, it's fascinating to me. It's so painful. You can't think of a more painful situation than the one that Israel is facing. There were hundreds of thousands of Israelis who took to the streets to protest the judicial reforms not that long ago. And this relatively big rally for the hostages, organized by the hostage families, 15 to 20,000 people. It's not nearly as many. So that's fascinating to me. Hamas, Hezbollah, which is the scarier enemy?
Hezbollah by far. The Israelis live in fear of a major war with Hezbollah that could start tomorrow. Israel will win, but they will suffer an order of magnitude more damage than Hamas was capable of, including to the central cities. The vast majority of Israelis see October 7th as an existential moment. The war with Hamas must be thoroughly won, or there will be a future war with Hamas and probably a future war with Hezbollah as well. They are fighting Hamas not only to beat Hamas, but also to deter Hezbollah in the hope that they can avoid a war in the north.
Right. I saw a video recently put out by, I think, Tikva Fund, entitled The Two-State Delusion, instead of two-state solution. Two-state solution from your point of view, possible still?
Possible. My academic friends believe in a two-state solution. Some Russians do, some don't. But the Hamas attacks stripped away any illusion that Hamas can be deterred. It can only be beaten now and suppressed in the future. Hamas is open about this. Hamas spokesman, Hamas will repeat its attacks again and again until Israel is completely destroyed. Now, Hamas won't succeed, but they intend to try, and Israel needs to make sure they cannot seriously try. And so any discussion of a two-state solution has to treat the West Bank separately from Gaza and has to take into account that Israel doesn't want to be here again in another 10 years.
So then in what other respects, what would that state look like then?
So for Israelis, a Palestinian state, or maybe two states, we don't know, has to be thoroughly demilitarized, with all borders controlled by Israel for the foreseeable future, which I think is at least 20 years. The lesson from Israel's withdrawal from Gaza and Lebanon has been learned. Border control is the basis for Israel's security and therefore the basis for future Palestinian independence. With that, would there be support for a truly demilitarized state from Palestinian? I think so. From many Israelis that I talked to, including many of the Russian Israelis. It remains for many the best long-run solution, short of giving the West Bank to Jordan, which Israel would love to do and Jordan won't take it, and giving Gaza to Egypt, which Israel would love to do and Egypt won't take it. Right. Many Israelis are skeptical that this can be achieved. They're not willing to compromise on security, but as a long-run solution, I still hear substantial support because the alternatives aren't good either. But with a major caveat, Israel needs to control all borders for the foreseeable future. Gaza has a border with Egypt. We know what flood of weapons came through the Gaza-Egypt border, smuggled in. For the future, Israel has to control that border. There can be Egyptian security, and then there can be Israeli security. And nothing gets in without passing both sets of security. Israel will have to control access to the Mediterranean Sea. Nothing else will be acceptable to the Israelis because they don't want to be back again in a situation where they're being attacked by a reasonably well-equipped army.
There's an irony, though, to this, is that, Israel has had a partial legal blockade over Gaza for years. And so there was control of the borders, during that time. Maybe you're imagining something more effective or more thorough. I'm actually not really sure, because we know for years before October 7th.
There was no Israeli control over the border between Egypt and Gaza.
Right. Yeah.
The Israelis learned that weapons were going to come in however Hamas could get them in.
True.
They had reasonably good control over the sea. They had good control over everything else. They didn't have control over the Gaza-Egypt border, and that was a mistake in hindsight.
Yeah, although it's their own border with Gaza that was breached.
But that wasn't where weapons were coming in.
Yeah, gotcha.
That's a different issue.
Gotcha. So that brings us to, and by the way, we should just note that when Bernie's talking about Russian-Israeli attitudes and academic attitudes, it's an interesting, dichotomy, if that's the right word for it, because they would often be in not different poles perhaps, but on different sides of center.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So speaking of security, talk about the security failures on October 7th.
They continue to be astonishing to most Israelis. The job of the Israeli army and military intelligence was to play what-if scenarios. And yet we learn in hindsight, the army had very few soldiers near Gaza. They ignored good information about what Hamas was planning because they didn't want to believe it. This is contrary to everything the Israelis believed about the army's competence. And the Israelis won't make that mistake again. They want greater security, secure borders everywhere for decades to come, because they don't trust the army. They need the security to be outside of Israel proper.
Right, so the ignoring of the warnings that you just referred to, there was talk and reporting relatively early on that what they were ignoring were warnings from young women soldiers who were working that border, who were doing that intelligence, and that, again, this being International Women's Month. Did you hear about that issue, that there was a certain sexism involved in that, and ageism perhaps because they were young people giving those warnings?
I'd say possible. We don't know why the warnings were ignored, but we know that the warnings were given and were ignored, and that the senior people said, this isn't real. Mm-hmm. Hamas isn't really that crazy. Right. And it turned out that they were that crazy.
Yes.
Still to come is a full investigation of what was known when, which specific people ignored the warnings. That's been postponed until after the war, but the Israelis are good at that. I think you saw that in the recent release of the investigation into the 45 ultra-Orthodox who were killed at a Lag BaOmer festival a few years ago. Right. They know how to do an internal investigation.
Right.
They will do one here too. We will know more, but we don't know enough now.
Right.
Is he a scholar or something?
Okay, please mute. If you're at home, please mute yourselves.
I'm mute.
Is Lee there?
Yes.
Please mute yourselves at home.
You're not, Denny.
Okay, we'll get that. So, sorry. Talk about Israelis buying firearms.
So an interesting part of spending time in Israel is soldiers on the streets and the trains and the train stations carrying automatic weapons. We're already ubiquitous because the soldiers are required to carry their weapons with them wherever they go. That is a source of comfort to the Jewish Israelis, and I suspect a source of discomfort to the Arab Israelis, although I have not heard of evidence of misuse. But beyond that, after October 7th, many more ordinary citizens are buying and carrying weapons, especially those living in the West Bank settlements, including the major ones close to the border with the West Bank, close to the border with Gaza, with Lebanon, with Syria. The Israelis served in the military. They know how to use a gun. They know how many lives were lost on October 7th because they trusted the army to defend them and the army failed. In general, people who served in the military can get permits, and more are asking. And the weapons come in handy sometimes. A common outcome for a terrorist attack in Israel, terrorist attacks, maybe kill somebody, maybe not. Terrorist is then shot and killed by nearby armed citizen. The Israelis are very happy with that outcome.
Right, and we see that a lot. You're right, that happens frequently, including very recently. The West Bank and settlements. Can you talk about that a little bit now as well?
Sure. So first, 500,000 Israelis live in settlements in the West Bank, Haggadah Mi'aravit, as they call it, or just Haggadah. Most of them in the major towns, in Ariel and Ma'ale Adumim and the like. Some live in smaller but legal settlements. A few live in illegal outposts. In the smaller settlements, the major settlements are mostly suburbs of Jerusalem in practice, right? Occupied by Israeli Jews. In the smaller settlements, which are scattered fairly widespread throughout the West Bank, the vast majority of people want to live peaceful lives. They see themselves as peaceful, law-abiding, and the Palestinians as terrorists. So a story from one settler, Yael Sergachev, who recently wrote to Kate, my wife. This is a translation from Russian. We and the Palestinians are different people. Palestinian children at the age of 12 are already ready to kill. Here, children learn Torah and organize a garage sale. Women in Jewish settlements bake bread and go to Torah lessons on Shabbat, and no one ever takes a machine gun or stones to kill Arabs. We live in a village where there are no locks, no thieves. I have a store where goods are standing on the street for a year and no one touches them. Yael Sergachev lives in Itamar, a small religious Zionist settlement around 500 people, not far from Hebron. It's been there since 1984. When she leaves the settlement, she wears a bulletproof vest. With reason. 2 Israelis were shot by terrorists while driving their car near Itamar last November. And random shooting attacks on Israelis driving cars in the West Bank are a regular occurrence. There are some crazy settlers who shoot back, often after a specific terrorist attack. In my view, Israel needs to treat them as terrorists, and it won't as long as a lead terrorist is in charge of Israel's security. But there aren't that many crazy settlers. They can be managed if the political will exists, which I hope it might under the next government. Some will exist. Some settlements get dismantled. Some Israeli terrorists get prosecuted, but more is needed. I think most Israelis understand that the Israeli terrorists deeply harm the Israeli cause, both by eroding international support and reinforcing Palestinian hate for the Jews, way out of proportion to their small numbers or the numbers of attacks they make on West Bank Palestinians.
Yes. So another somewhat off-script question, though. Some of these young settlers, some of the crazy ones, and of course, most of them are like your friend, Kate's friend, who gave that very interesting, enlightening quote. But some of it's not only shooting back, but some of them are doing, maybe we wouldn't call them terrorists, but vandalism, damage to crops,
Absolutely.
Intimidation.
Absolutely.
Right, so that's happening as well.
It's happening as well. It's not nearly on the scale of the attacks going the other way,
Right.
But it's there, and Israel should be, I think, way more aggressive in putting a stop to it.
Okay, big issue is the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox and army service.
Yeah, so everyone serves in the army. The Bedouin, the Druze, the Christian Arabs, everyone but the Muslim Arabs and the Haredim. One positive outcome I hope will come from the Hamas war is that the Haredi exemption will fall. It's intolerable to most Israelis that the Haredi get major social welfare benefits from the state and rely on other Israelis to fight and die to protect them. On this, the Israeli academics and the Russian Israelis are in complete agreement. For the Russians, it's even worse. Many are either not halakhically Jewish or can't prove that they are. They can't get married in Israel because of the Orthodox rabbi monopoly on marriage. That infuriates them. They can serve in the army, they can die defending Israel, but they can't get married in Israel. The Haredi exemption may last as long as the current government does, but not much longer. And you're seeing signs of that in the Israeli press, where more and more politicians are saying this has to end, and I think it will. In the long run, this can be hugely important. If the Haredi men serve in the army, many will become more integrated into Israeli society, and that has to happen for Israel to remain a liberal and democratic state. And maybe now it will.
Okay. Sort of last two double questions, perhaps. One is Israel's role, talked about much recently, securing aid into Gaza, how that has led to major problem, but there might be some solutions that we're contemplating now. And then sort of your final thought on there being an opportunity for peace after all.
So let's take them one at a time. Is there hunger in Gaza? Yes. Is there more in the north among the people who stayed and ignored the warnings to leave and go south? Yes, that's where the recent troubles have been. Is Israel doing all it could? Surely not. Is it doing a lot? Yes. What we learned a week ago when Israel tried to help by protecting aid trucks against looting and got slammed for it was Israel can't be in charge of distributing aid. Hamas will just loot the trucks. We need somebody else. And here I am deeply disappointed in the US and frankly, many other countries for blaming Israel without coming up with their own solution. Israel cannot be in charge of distributing aid in Gaza while the Israeli soldiers are being shot at by Hamas. They will not do it. The Israelis will not send their children to die to deliver food while being shot by Hamas. They'll send the food. They would help distribute it if they weren't being shot at the same time. But put both together and no. What I don't understand is why the West, including the US, isn't doing more. This is a solvable problem. So the US has now finally, we're in March, not October, announced we're going to start sending aid by ship. Well, wasn't that obvious in November? The US still has the view of we're going to put the aid offshore and send it into Gaza, and then it's not our problem. Well, then whose problem is it? What I would do is put 1,000 Marines onshore to distribute the food and dare Hamas to shoot them. Possibly they will, I bet they won't, but if they do, we learn a lot about Hamas and we stop blaming Israel for why the Gazans are hungry. But the US isn't willing to do that, neither is any Western European country. They just want to blame Israel for not doing it, and I find that crazy, while at the same time recognizing Israel could have done more sooner. But at the end of the day, once food and supplies get into Gaza, somebody has to distribute them, and nobody is stepping up.
Opportunities for peace.
They exist. All major Arab states want peace with Israel. The US, for its part, is saying we want a path toward a Palestinian state, not a state today, a path that the Palestinian Arabs will have to walk down, and who knows if they will, and probably they won't because they didn't the last time. All seem to agree that a future Palestinian state can be demilitarized, though exactly what that means and whether it would satisfy the Israelis remains to be seen. But any agreement on a future path will involve the Palestinians being dragged along as unwilling participants. Still, maybe a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the United States that no one expects the Palestinians to honor can be viable if the borders are sufficiently secure. But there's a competing narrative with broad support in Israel, which is less optimistic and goes like this. We'll negotiate with over two states with the Palestinians, but not without them when they're ready. We gave away too much in Oslo in 1993. We got bombings, terror, and the first and second intifada. We left Gaza in 2005, expected peace, and got war. We left North Lebanon in 2000 and got rockets and the continued risk of war with Hezbollah. We maintained control over the West Bank, and it's a darn good thing that we did. The Palestinian policy of paying terrorists for killing Israelis has to stop. Pay for slay, they call it. But it's a sign of a deeper problem. Too many Palestinians don't want peace. The Palestinian Authority won't even reject Hamas's unbelievable brutality. Israelis saw the West Bank Palestinians cheering for Hamas after October 7th, and they won't forget. Another story from a good friend, Misha Tuval, who's a PhD historian. His PhD advisor was murdered walking down the street in Jerusalem, stabbed in the back. The terrorist was caught, sent to an Israeli jail. The Palestinian Authority rewarded his family with a stipend for his heroism in stabbing an old man in the back. The terrorist got out of jail in under 10 years, returned home, where he was treated as a hero. A young wife was arranged for him, a huge wedding celebration attended by the whole town. And Misha Tuval watched all this happening, and he's now a security hawk, and I don't blame him. Maybe worth saying that the Palestinians can't get today the deal they could have gotten after Oslo in 1983. 93. The deal from Ehud Barak that they rejected in 2000. The deal from Ehud Olmert that they rejected in 2008. Israel has no reason to expect Mahmoud Abbas to accept a worse deal today, which is the best he can get. The Israelis also understand that the Palestinians won't be able to get in another 20 years the deal they still could get today. Time is on Israel's side. Many Israelis understand this. The Palestinians don't or pretend not to. And so we've got 30 years since Oslo of experience with failed peace efforts because not enough of the Palestinians want peace. Golda Meir said in 1957, peace will come when the Palestinians love their children more than they hate the Jews. That time wasn't then, it isn't today, and it doesn't look like it's going to be soon, much as I and most Israelis wish it were otherwise. So there's a possibility, but there are challenges, and it remains the case that, leave aside the details, most Israelis want peace with the Palestinian Arabs. Most Palestinian Arabs don't want peace with Israel, which is rather weird.
So to close, we'll do questions later on, but you can do your closing.
Okay.
Now.
Maybe a couple of closing remarks. First, there will be a next government. Bibi Netanyahu is deeply unpopular, not because of his politics, because his own politics, leave aside his coalition, are not that far from the median Israeli view. But there will be a next government, and we will have a different prime minister. When? I don't know. Then maybe I wanted to give you a quote from Zev Jabotinsky in a famous essay, The Iron Wall, in 1923. So Jabotinsky was an early Zionist who promoted Israeli strength, Israeli military strength, Israeli ability to fight if they had to, because they thought they would have to. And he wrote in 1923, as long as the Arabs feel there is the least hope of getting rid of us, they will refuse to give up this hope in return for either kind words or bread and butter, because they're not a rabble, but a living people. But he also wrote, there will always be two nations in Palestine, and that he was prepared to take an oath binding ourselves and our descendants that we shall never do anything contrary to the principle of equal rights, and we shall never try to eject anyone. The Palestinian Authority slogan, the Hamas slogan, Palestine from the river to the sea, to my mind, has to be replaced with Jabotinsky's vision of one land shared by two nations. And unfortunately, today, most Israelis will go there. They'll argue over the sharing terms, but they'll go there. Too many Palestinians will not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernie Black. Thank you very, very much, Bernie. And I know that people, because I could hear the little subdued commentary, will have questions for you during Kiddush, but very grateful for your insights and sharing them with us this morning.